This stems from a work that I'm doing, on a general introduction to AI ethics in the French language, and especially for the Algorithmic Fairness chapter. But this is really not what's in the chapter. It's kind of something that popped into my mind a couple of weeks ago only, that strongly relates to many issues that were deep into that chapters, but though the idea are kind of very recent, and the only excuse that I have for presenting something that is so recent in front of you is that once I started thinking about it, I couldn't stop thinking about it. So I had to get it off my chest today and try to work it through. So basically, what I'm very interested in my fairness chapter is the notion of epistemic limitation in bureaucratic decision making, because I try to present in my book the algorithmization of decision making as a new phase in the history of bureaucracy, basically, in bureaucratic decision making. And as a philosopher of science, I'm very much interested in epistemic limitations, especially epistemic limitations of bureaucratic decision making. Okay, so that's a broad context. Now, really, it's not even an introduction; it's already an outline. Just jumping right into it. So, what I'm going to try and do in this presentation, in the limited amount of time that I have, is to present 5 claims, and it is going to get bolder and bolder as I go along. So the first is the existence of a problem in bureaucratic decision making, which is a problem of breaking ties. It's basically the problem of making a difference between 2 individuals in order to achieve a decision, a fair decision, of course, a fair and informed decision. That's the first thing that I'm going to claim. The second claim is that this is relevant for ML-based, very model and very modern decision making, and also for classical decision making at the same time. And that this history of breaking ties, being able to make the difference between individuals and in decision-making process, is worthy of empirical investigation in its forms and sources, and also on political and ethical reflection at the same time. So it's really a worthy topic. That's a more robust and more modest at the same time, not surprisingly, part of the talk. And if I have time, I'm going to try to go to 2 other claims that are bolder in nature. The fourth claim is that in the absence of a universal use of a fair lottery, so basically, if you don't break every tie with a lottery, basically with a random coin toss, if you don't have that, then some decision-making processes have to be composite in the sense that they have to mix predictive knowledge and non-predictive knowledge or factors or criteria, what have you, in order to achieve the decision and in order to break the problems of ties. So basically, decision cannot flow directly from prediction because of epistemic limitations. In this case, of the problem of ties. All right, that's the fourth claim, a little bit bolder, but I think still standing. And then the fifth claim, if I have time, is me going all Braveheart on you, and just if that side is only bearable to you, picture me bare-chested and running towards you, wielding a sword and roaring a war cry of some sorts, and trying to lay down my academic life, not for the freedom of the Scottish people, but probably just for the sake of a conversation on the meaning and scope of algorithmic fairness criteria. So that's a bit less exciting, but that's what I'm going to try and do for fun in the last time part of that, if I do have time. So what I'm trying to say here is that many current statistical criteria of fairness that I use in the algorithmic fairness literature to see if a decision-making process is fair are basically not criteria of fairness at all. They're criteria of bias in predictive performances, and that's not the same thing, because, reference to claim 4, they cannot be applied to the non-predictive component of decision-making, which has to exist according to claim 4. So that's the bold fifth claim that I hope I will be able to get to. And so that's it. You have the entire content of the talk now. So what I did start off from, basically, is maybe the greatest, and so in my chapter on fairness, I always try to contrast, ML, very modern issues with more issues that were raised by classical algorithm, whatever that means, which means non-ML, basically algorithm, non-AI at least algorithm. And so I had to take as an example on fairness, maybe the most famous example of an algorithm-based controversy in the public space in France in the last decades, which was the APB Parcoursup controversy. So very briefly, this was an algorithm that was used to match students, prospective students, just coming out of high school, with slots in curricula. And the algorithm that is used is a classic matching algorithm for that type of task, which is the algorithm of stable marriages, which is some very desirable mathematical properties that I will not insist on. What is important to remember here for the purpose of this talk is that you need, for that algorithm to work, you need to have the preferences of both parties, the schools on one hand and the students, or prospective students on the other end, and they have to express their preferences as an ordered list. Basically, that's necessary for the algorithm to work. So you have to express your preferences with an ordered list, strictly ordered list, and that's where the problem starts. So basically, because it was necessary for the algorithm to work, the administration asked, even when it wasn't necessary before, it has for a strictly ordered list because it was necessary for the algorithm to function. And that was a problem actually for thumb curricula, especially curricula with very large number of applicants. We have curricula in France that have more than 15,000, more than 20,000 applicants. And according to that task, you should make an ordered list of those 20,000 people with 4 digits. And of course, the problem here is that it's mathematically impossible because you don't have enough numbers. You have 10 to the 4th numbers, and you have 10 to the 5th applicant, and that's just not enough. It was usually actually initially noticed by the president of the University of Paris 1, that basically the task that they were supposed to solve was mathematically impossible. And you could say, well, we could just add some precisions in the numbers that are used for that expression of the list. But the problem is the numbers that are used are grades. It's basically a weighted average of the grades of the students that is used to create that list, that ordered list. And as you know, all of you know, I guess you're all lecturers, and you all know that there's our severe precision limitation in meaningful grades. Saying that I don't know if many teachers would believe that you can define a meaningful grade up to 1,000th of a point. Especially in the social sciences, many of us believe that we have a grade over 20 in France, and many of us believe that even that is too accurate. So you can imagine that what we think of a grade over the 1,000th of a point. So basically, because of limitations in your input data and the measurement of your input data, which are the grades, you have an epistemic necessity of having a lot of ties in large cohorts of students. Okay, you cannot avoid it. It's just an epistemic necessity, considering the task at hand. But you can, okay, so it's a bureaucratic. You could say it's a bureaucratic issue. You just have to make a difference that doesn't really mean anything. Well, it's only very consequential at the decision boundary. If you are the 2 last students that are going to be accepted in the school, then breaking the tie between the 2 of you is going to be sensitive. But that's statistically, that's not so many people, right? And we could say, and we'll come back to that in that case, because we cannot make the difference between the students, having a lottery, just having a random coin toss to break up the tie between the 2 students that you cannot distinguish is fair, and we should do it. It's just a bureaucratic question. And that's exactly how it was done in the first version of the platform based on that algorithm, which was called APB, admission post bac. And that's what the computer scientists in charge of it decided to do. They would do a random coin toss. Actually, originally, the reason for that is they didn't have the right to use academic criteria in some curricula, even if they had small cards, so they end up with a lot of ties. But I just, took the other examples because it was neater from my point. But I'll come back to the other issue in a moment. And this seemingly innocuous bureaucratic maneuver to solve a technical problem ignited a huge controversy in France, like the greatest controversy implicating an algorithm in the entire history of our country, basically. It was a huge scandal. Students' organizations were against it. Many presidents of universities were against it. It was a huge controversy, really huge. And it determined the entire fate of the algorithm after that. Basically, everything that the government did after that was to say, well, we're changing the system because if we don't change the system the way we change it, then it's random coin toss and it's a scandal and it's atrocious. So basically, the entire political fate of that algorithm and in large way of the admission system in higher education was determined by that controversy about breaking ties by a random coin toss. It has been hugely influential, and it might really, in a way, carve the perception of algorithm by the French public for maybe another decade or so, because it was a huge scandal. So you can see that this was statistically marginal, but of enormous political relevance. This problem of breaking the ties between two individuals that you could not separate by their grades. So you could say, well, oh, that's okay, fine, but that's just one example, right? One historical example, object for meditation, but just one example. But that's the thing is it only the only one? Is it the only example of this? It's the only that became a major scandal, politically speaking, but is it the only case where this problem of breaking the ties between two individuals to reach a final decision because of epistemic limitations? Is it the only place where this is happening and meaningful? And I'm not sure. And I would very much love to think that this deserves some empirical investigation. For instance, there are some schools in France, especially very prestigious schools like medicine school or national administration schools, who have an outgoing ranking of their students. And this outgoing ranking is very important because it determines who picks first the most prestigious medical specialty, like being a cardiologist or a brain surgeon, or who gets to get admitted in the most prestigious branches of government. So it's very important in terms of prestige, this outgoing ranking of students when they leave the school. And it has to be a strict order because it's a pecking order, basically. It's pecking order, it has to be strict. And I do not know how they do it. So I would love to know how they do it because it's a very sensitive issue. And I would like to see if they have problems of breaking ties too, for instance. And that's just an example from the top of my head because it's a kind of a huge topic of empirical investigation onto itself. You might say, and at that point you may say, well, okay, Maël, but maybe it's a problem for old-fashioned decision-making processes or old-fashioned algorithm. But with machine learning, we have like data abundance, we have personalization of predictions, we have data spaces of very high dimensionality that allows you to see the individual in the data set. It's not like we have like four dimensions in our data space. We have hundreds, thousands of them. So we can make a difference. Whenever we want to make a difference, we can make a difference. This is no longer a problem. And I'm not sure about that either. I would very much argue that there are empirical work to be done on this issue too, because especially what I'm interested in, and in large bureaucratic organizations, they still operate within severe data limitations. Not only in the precision of measurements, like we've seen with the case of grades, but that's just one variable. So you could say, well, if you have a problem with one variable, you won't have that problem with 1,000 variables. It's just a matter of beefing up the dimensionality of their data space. But I do not know whether administrations are free to beef up the dimensionality of their data spaces, so to say, basically because of resource constraints, especially of course time and finance. Also, of course, because of privacy issue, if you're not Google and Facebook, you're not entitled to spy on everybody all of the time. You're allowed to do that. If you're Google and Facebook, you can spy on the whole world. But if you're just a French administration, you're not allowed to do that. You can't just have 400 variables on everybody all the time. That doesn't work. But also because of issues of fairness. Two examples of that, why you would actually reduce the numbers of factors that you take into consideration to make a profile of people for fairness issue, not for privacy issue, but for fairness issue. Some of you may have heard of the Composite case of an algorithm that was computing a risk score for of recidivism for American inmates, and this has been a topic of a huge controversy too in the algorithmic fairness literature because it was accused of being racist. But a more general accusation that has been kind of missed by the majority of the literature, surprisingly, is that actually the algorithm used predictors that are not desert-based for a punitive decision, which is keeping people in jail. For instance, they're going to ask you whether your father went in jail or whether your friends went in jail, because those questions are actually predictors of recidivism. But of course, if you're a lawyer, you can think this is a perversion of the theory of punishment that says that you cannot be submitted to a punitive measure on something that is not of your responsibility, even if that something is a predictor. Okay, so for fairness issue, you can decide to drop the use of a predictive factor purely for fairness issues. Okay, and that's what we should do. And it's only because of the use of that predictor. Okay, not the predictor per se. If it was used to target individuals for help, for instance, as it used to be the case before in the sociology of crime, this wouldn't be a problem. But if you use it to send people in jail, then it's a fairness issue. So just an example of why we can give up on a predictor, basically, and diminish how fine-grained our data space is. And finally, last example, I have to hurry. Basically, fairness also means that sometimes access to a social good is conceived as a right, and not as a selective privilege based on merit, and hence not conditioned on a predictive assessment of your performance of what you're going to do with that social good if I give it to you. That was also at the heart of the political controversy about this whole algorithm to access higher education in France. Some people would just say, but this is not a privilege, this is a right. You have a right to access higher education. And as such, you should not be submitted to something like an evaluation of how good you're going to be as a student, because it's a right. And you get to do what you want with the right, not somebody else get to choose where you go. So this was kind of the controversy that people had, that if you basically something is a universal right, why in hell would you use predictive assessment of what you're going to do with that universal right? Fundamental issue there. And the question I'm also wondering is whether these could also be due to limitations, not in data, in limitations in measurement or limitations in the numbers of variables they can include, but also in limitations of models. I'm having a conversation with one of my former computer science students on that, but that's just a question, completely open. So basically, and that's basically the end of my first three claims. You could say, okay, Maël, you have eloquently proven, okay, you're not thinking that, but whatever. I want you to think that, please. You have eloquently proven that this problem exists empirically, and that it is of political relevance, and that maybe it should be the topic of some empirical investigation and philosophical reflection in political philosophy. But it's not really an ethical dilemma. Not from a rational ethicist point of view, because, well, okay, there was a huge controversy because people do not understand that lottery can be fair, okay? If my assessments of how good you're going to be as a student make you an exact tie with another student, then let's have a lottery, and that's fair. And lotteries can be fair, and in particular, lotteries can be fair in a situation of epistemic limitation. If my underlying predictive model is unable to make the difference between two individuals, especially because of lack of resolution power in my data, for whatever reason that is, then it's fair to make a lottery. So just all those people going crazy over that algorithm in France, I understand this is a political issue, but it's not an ethical issue. And that's fine. I'm not going to argue against that. I'm just going to say that in order for you to make that point, if you're like a defender of fair lotteries, you have to articulate the condition for a fair lottery first that you want to apply there. And you need to evaluate the relevance to real-world decision making. So you need to go through the result of the empirical investigation, basically. So which means that you cannot decide that just over the top of your head. You need to work a bit. And you need probably to answer to some principle that seem to have been underlying to the APB controversy, according to my very tentative guess, such that a real consequential decision affecting an individual must be grounded in a reason that is related to that individual. Okay, so basically the idea is that, okay, you can do random coin toss for deciding who's going to play chess first, but not for who's going to come out of jail, or not for who's going to have access to such and such education. That doesn't work. It's not fair. Okay, that was the basic idea. So there's a kind of cross talking of the people on the both sides of the aisles, because people who love fair lottery is going to say, hey, the lottery is fair because it doesn't know anything about you. And the people on the other side of the aisle are going to say, but I wanted to know something about me. I want it. So why are you submitting me to that blind mechanism? I wanted to decide according to who I am somehow. Okay. This is going to be the controversy you're going to face. I'm not taking any position on this. Okay. You do whatever you like with that. Now to introduce the fourth claim, say, let's look at the other branch. Let's say, okay, we cannot solve all the ties with just fair lotteries. Okay, there are some cases where you're going to have to add another component to your decision making in order to break ties. And by definition, by hypothesis, this component is not going to be predictive. Okay, it's not going to be based on a predictive assessment of how well you're going to do, because, well, you try that and you reach a tie. Okay, so now you add to use another predictive, non-predictive factor, basically in decision making, which has to be fair and which might affect the final statistics, the final distribution of your results, such as a redistributive criterion. A positive discrimination, if you want to think of the strongest form, is just a redistribution based on income or location, such as it is legal in France, or whether you have a family, or that kind of criteria, redistributive criteria. And so claim number 4, and I'm already running late, so basically, if you take that road, and if you think that not every tie can be broken up with a fair lottery, basically what you say is that in order to be able to break ties, when we need to break them, we need composite decision procedures, be mixing predictive and non-predictive factors. And the problem is, so that was my claim number 4. If you say that, you're basically saying that decision doesn't flow from prediction. Okay, predictive knowledge is not enough to reach decision. You need something else, and you need to have a conversation about the exact scope of what is the exact scope of prediction in decisions. That predictive knowledge sometimes is maxed out, and we need to add something up. And they need to define and understand fairness with the understanding that decision doesn't only flow from prediction, it flows from something else. Okay. And so the existence of that composite decision procedure is an important fact unto itself. Okay, if you think of that in that way. And the thing that I would like, well, that's my 5th claim, the rest of this presentation. So I'm going to have to expedite that in the most brutal fashion. Probably a minute or so. So let me be as brutal as I can be. So basically, my brave heart moment, my heroic moment, was just that final moment when I show you that actually it affects our understanding of the fashionable topic of the statistical criteria of fairness. Basically, so statistical criteria of fairness are big part of the AI ethic literature. Some of you were there when we discussed a very recent paper on that in the ML AI group a couple weeks ago. And those criteria are just a way to evaluate whether, as supposed to evaluate whether an algorithm is fair by looking at the distribution of results. And what I claim to do, there's no criteria that you could apply, which is statistical parity. You could apply to the kind of procedures that I'm thinking of, because it's, to be very brutal here, it's model agnostic. It's not predicated on the presence of a predictive model inside your decision-making procedure. But if you look at, and this is where I get very brutal, but if you look at this criteria is very unfashionable. It's the least popular of criteria right now. If you look at the fairness metric literature right now, what they do basically is try to measure how the distribution of result among the populations has to be constrained in order to check for the existence of an unfavorable bias against a given population. And basically, there are three families there, and I try to designate them with my own terminology for people who are not familiar in that literature, but at the same time, we are running out of time, so I don't know if that's gonna help anyone. But basically, you have three families of criteria. One that is about global accuracy. If 70% of your predictions are correct for whites, you should have the same rate for African Americans. The other is the identity of unfavorable or favorable error rates, or both, across populations. So if you have 20% of low risk classification that are erroneous for white inmates, for instance, you need the same error rate for African Americans. And the other is calibration on the meaning of risk scores, basically, so that they have the same meaning for every population. What you can see immediately, and this is going to be my conclusion, is that all of those three families of criteria are designed for the predictive part of the decision. And as such, they're all about bias in predictive performances. And as such, they're unapplicable to composite decision procedures. Which means if I have to push the provocation button, basically is that, let me switch to we need to reevaluate the scope of statistical criteria of fairness and the actual relation to the decision. This is something that we've seen in the paper, actually, in the reading group that by Hedden from this year. Basically, what I'm trying to do here is not only to say that you should distinguish prediction and decision, as he said in that paper, but that we should distinguish between predictive part and non-predictive part of the decision algorithm in general, and in particular in the case of epistemic limitations. And this is going to be my final sentence. Basically, statistical criteria of fairness are a misnomer for criteria designed for predictive performances of models. And this is not the same thing as fairness, because prediction is not the same thing as decision. Decisions do not flow directly from predictions, because decision cannot be reduced to simply applying the knowledge that came out of your predictive model. And I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much for your kind attention.